Hello and welcome to the Oxford Policy Podcast. I'm Aathma and this is my peer Cristian with us. And we have my favorite professor and our distinguished guest for today, Professor Maya Tudor, Professor of Public Policy and Politics here at Blavatnik School of Government. Welcome, Maya.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So before we get to the question and to the substance, could you tell us a bit about your background and why you chose to study and deepen your understanding on nationalism and democracy? And why did you choose to be an academic?
Wow, those are lots of questions, but they are related. So it's a good set of questions to ask together. So I am half Indian, half German by background. So my mother's German, my father's Indian, was born in India. And then my mother remarried eventually an American, which is why I sound American. And it was this kind of moving across cultures very early on in my childhood and exposure to how different people lived and the different opportunities that they had led me to study economics at first. But my first job was working with a well-known economist, and it became clear to me in that time that a lot of the policies that the World Bank was making, so it was the chief economist of the World Bank, were not driven by what the right economic policies, what the optimal economic policies were, but rather by the politics, who had voting rights at the World Bank and such like. So I began to be interested in studying politics, and that took me to a public policy school, much like this one, and then eventually to do a PhD. So why nationalism and democracy? Probably because I was slightly confused about my own national identity. How do I think about where I belong? And especially when you have older generations who didn't really understand that you could be members of multiple countries or have affiliations to multiple places, that I thought was a very interesting question. So that's why I began to study both nationalism and questions of democracy.
Why did you choose to be an academic? Why not a politician? Why not maybe an economist with a specialty in nationalism? Like it could be anything and everything, but you chose to be an academic. Why that?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things that came together. The first was that it felt to me as a master's in public policy student, I was skating over the surface of explanatory power for phenomena I was seeing. And I just really wanted to understand it at a deeper level. And that was only possible once you did a PhD. And as so often is the case, it wasn't just my professional career takes precedence, but I also at that time got married and had a baby while I was writing my dissertation. And the policy world, which I always thought I'd go back to, I always thought I would be in the world of at least policymaking, if not politics, was a world which is pretty unforgiving for a balanced lifestyle. And so to be perfectly honest, academics are paid in part in flexibility. And so, you have an opportunity to work with super smart people like the two of you and who ask great questions. And the policy world, the policy school, I thought was the best mix of getting to ask the big questions, which it must be said academia doesn't always incentivize. In fact, in political science, it can be a little bit of the opposite. Small questions that you can really causally identify the intervention or the what's driving policy change. But I'm pretty lucky in that I just decided I would do it only if I could focus on big, important questions, such as, why does India stabilize its democracy compared to Pakistan, which very early on has a lot of instability? And that was, for example, what I wrote my dissertation in my first book on.
So since we're getting into India and Pakistan, let's get into the substance of it. Yeah. Currently, we keep hearing that democracy is in crisis. But I'm sure that every generation felt like that at some point or the other during their lifetime. And I'm also aware that we are living in cycles and things go up and down. But from where you sit, um, is it really going in crisis? And what do we do as a generation? What is the one thing that we have to do right now? Nothing too deep or anything, but just like that one thing that you want us to do as students.
Great. Well, so I think it is in a crisis, but it's a crisis that is different from the previous crises. So typically, democracy died around the world in the 20th century through coups, military often in nature. Tanks would roll in the street. In India, even if it wasn't a coup, it was what they would call in the Latin American context an autogolpe. A leader would seize power and they would sort of immediately arrest opposition leaders. That is not the way democracy is dying today. It is dying much more because people who dissent from government, people who don't agree with government policies and therefore criticize the government, their ability to actually criticize government, whether it's through access to independent media, whether it's the right to assemble, whether it's the right to organize an opposition political party without harassment and due process and legal protections. That's the way that we see democracy dying. Now, it's important to say that not everyone agrees with me, including professors in this school who I've had discussions with this about. Adam Jaworski famously, a political scientist who's studied democracy for a long time, he says, look, we still see electoral turnover. We still see people being voted out of office. So, for example, we saw this recently in Hungary with Viktor Orban in power for 16 years being voted out of office. So the question, and this is just a really important question to ask yourselves, how do you know if you're right or wrong? What would you look to understand this? So the analogy I use is a chessboard. So in a game of chess, you have opponents and one is trying to beat the other in the moment of elections. And, the chessboard is flat. So people have equal opportunities. It's about strategy. It's about whose policy is appealing to the voter. But if the incumbent in power is denying media space or fair media coverage because, they have control over media through lots of levers, such as, being able to, you need licenses from the government to operate in a media environment, and those licenses are denied to organizations that are too favorable to opposition, right? So there are lots of behind the scenes that isn't necessarily very clear to people watching, the public watching, that the chessboard is tilting. And so it's much harder for opposition to win at the polls. Now, does that mean the world is less democratic? I would argue yes. That does mean the world is less democratic. That doesn't mean you don't get people at some point getting fed up with an incumbent in power and coming together to overthrow them. But it does mean that your ability to do so fairly at the ballot box has declined. And so in that sense, democracy is declining. Now, you asked me a second question. What do each of you do about it? The most important thing I would say is when someone is criticizing the government, even if you disagree with them, that you defend their right to dissent. It's too easy to, in this world of social media, echo chambers, and in where we live and interact in our social circles with people just like us, to really not listen to people who disagree with you. But the person who disagrees with the government today might be you tomorrow. And to understand that the right to dissent is a very important part of actually getting government to work well. And this is something that is, the optics don't look very good for democracies, because democracies are often, they're gridlocked. If there's corruption, it rises to the surface and people report on it. The media reports on it. But if it stays hidden, and it's still happening, as it's much more likely to do in non-democratic systems, that doesn't mean it's not happening. But the optics to individuals and who are looking across systems and say, well, look, you don't see these kinds of crises in, countries like Singapore, but the media is very tightly controlled by the government in places like that.
Very interesting. And staying on this topic of democracy and nationalism, we see that now in the world there are a lot of populist or even authoritarian leaders in power, such as Trump, Xi Jinping, Mondi. In Europe, we see a far-right surge, as in Le Pen, AfD in Germany. These actors, they operate in different systems and they have different toolkits. But do they share? They have a lot of similarities. So I want to ask you, what is the thing that they have common, that is common in all of them? What do they share?
Let me just say that populism is a discursive technique, right? It's a way in which an appeal in which the leader says the elites are corrupt, or would-be leader, and a political
Yes.
entrepreneur says the elites are corrupt, so elect me and I will solve your problems. And the people, the public, can never be wrong. So that's what populism is. And what do they have in common is that, generally speaking, across the world, we've seen inequality between countries decline, but inequality within countries on the rise. And what that means is increasingly an elite, often an elite that has better economic opportunities, that is more global in its orientation, is pulling away from the normal people in terms of experience, because inequality is growing and what life looks like for the top 1% is very, very different for even the average person.
Hmm.
And there's a sense increasingly across these societies that the system isn't working for the average person. And to some degree, they're not wrong, because we have systems which allow that kind of inequality to exist. So inequality is one important driver. It's important to say that in not every case is democratic backsliding been led by actors on the right. It tends to be in many of the countries you've mentioned on the right, but in some Latin American countries, it's on the left. That is, leaders have led democratic backsliding. So that's one thing, or two things that they have in common. They use populist appeals. Second, they're presiding over societies that are increasingly unequal within them, and in which everyday individuals see the very wealthy pulling away from them. And the third is that almost always there's a battle over who and what represents the nation. So nationalism, who is the we, is a core narrative of contention in the politics of the time. So let's take, for example, India. India's historic national story was one of unity and diversity. And for the past dozen years that Narendra Modi has been in power and the BJP, there has been a concerted push, and research is showing that it is affecting everyday conceptions of belonging, that to be Indian is more associated with being Hindu, and that has real effects on what happens to the rights of minorities in those countries.
Yeah, so sticking on the nationalist topic, we see that history is in cycles, right? And nationalism is returning once again. So we had a lot of other ideologies such as liberalism, socialism, even the EU's post-national project. But still we see that in all countries, especially in the EU, we see that nationalism is still coming back. So did we not find an ideology that can compete with nationalism? And is nationalism the strongest ideology and possible the last ideology for humans to live in for how society works for humans?
What's happened in the past 50 years progressively is that individuals have come to identify increasingly with more micro identities, that solidarity in large groups within society has in many ways diminished. So and social capital, what I would call social capital, political scientists call social capital, but connections between people who are different. Just think about, ask yourselves, where do you meet people who are different? So 50 years ago, you were likely to meet people living next to you. And this is true in almost all countries, not every country. People living next to you might have been of a different political persuasion. They might have been of a slightly different class structure. You would have met in libraries, in parks, in community centers. But increasingly, both because of social media, which is algorithmically driving us to be in like-minded communities, because of something that is true in Western countries that social scientists, demographers call assortative mating. So you're much more likely to partner in a romantic sense and in a long-term life sense with people who are of similar educational and income backgrounds than you. You're seeing less mixing in society. But we all need identities that bind us to other people because we are social beings. This is something that, Yuval Harari talks about it in *Sapiens*, the need for every human to be part of communities. We are literally wired to act together as social beings. So where do we find an identity that binds us to different kinds of people? We don't have that many identities left that do that. And the nationalism is a particular kind of identity, particularly important because it binds us to our nation state, which is the most important unit of political power. When you think about the things that you talk about here on the Policy Podcast, whether it's climate change or inequality, where's the most important lever for addressing that? It's not at the international level and it's not at the regional local level. It's the nation state. And there's a reason it's hyphenated. So nationalism continues to be an important identity because it is used regularly by politicians and because it binds us at an imagined level to lots of people who are really different for us. That's one of the ways in which nationalism is unique. Religion is also that kind of identity. So it's not the only one, but it's an important one because of its relationship to state power.
Okay, thank you.
So when you speak about identity, right, or religion or different sorts of like you say, the Russian doll identity, people always turn or currently are turning to nationalist leaders like Trump or Modi because they promise something in return. Is that something, if you could define that something for me, is it identity? Is it status? Is it economic growth? What is that something that people are always getting drawn towards these leaders?
If I could only choose one thing, it would be recognition of their problems. And there are many ways to do that. Partly it's the appeal to an understanding of belonging that might have been historical. Partly that might be the very particular schemes, such as cooking stove schemes that Modi is promising in India. So the suite of things that you do to be seen is very varied. But being seen by your leaders, believing that they understand your plight, they understand the problems facing you today, because they are giving voice to those problems, that is the most important. And one thing I would say is that this runs counter to many of the canonical theories of political science. The median voter theorem held was that you just need to appeal to this mythical average voter. But people don't always vote their pure economic interests. And that's one thing in the last few decades, a decade and a half, we have certainly seen again and again in politics. But the person who can effectively make you feel seen and who probably increasingly can control the social media narrative, those are two, I would say, important factors.
So if I could take an example of India, because I'm from India. So Modi, we had a long time of Congress being in power. And some people, and even though the Hindus are definitely the majority, and it has always been the majority since independence, they felt like they were unseen and their problems were smaller. And because of which, of course, him being a strategist and a leader, took advantage of that. But I understand that um, in India, it's just so much more complex than that. There's always caste, and it's just not Hindus or Muslims. There's so much of sub-caste and everything. So, in a very complex setting, how did he manage to show that the entire majority in India, that he could listen, he could be the person to solve all their problems? It just seems like an extraordinary, I'm not talking about whether it's right or wrong, but it's an extraordinary strategy that he did.
It's an extraordinary achievement.
It's achievement, but I'm deeply always confused because there's just so much difference between all of us in India. But at the same time, that unifying factor, he found out about it and then used it in electioneering strategy. So I just wanted to ask you, how is that possible? Can nationalism be that? Is it just nationalism then?
No, it's not. It's never. When you're trying to explain, your question is, how does Modi manage it? How does, in this incredibly one of the most diverse political entities on earth, how has he managed to be so many things to so many different people? And it's not one thing. It's multiple. It was different appeals at different elections. So in the 2014 election, there was an absolute focus on economic development. And coming on the heels of scandals in the incumbent government, which at the time was Congress-led, it just appealed to a very broad range of people. And a sense that he had done an effective job of leading the state, Gujarat, in which he came from. And he was chief minister before coming to national power. Now, Gujarat did do well economically. It's notable that minorities in that state did, despite Gujarat being a very wealthy state, did much worse than on average. So even there was a kind of laying bare of what the political tactic was. Now, playing us versus them within a polity is pretty much the oldest tactic in the book. When you want to deliver on something and you can't, you play us versus them politics. And in 2014, it wasn't. He was absolutely powered by Hindu nationalist groups, in particular the social movement, the RSS. That's the base of the kind of social movement that really powers the BJP, that went and knocked on doors and really pounded the pavement to help deliver votes for Modi in a way that they hadn't in bringing out previous prime ministers, BJP prime ministers to office. So one was a focus on economic development in 2014 with the sort of dog whistling Hindu nationalism. In 2019, when he came to power with an even larger majority, and he said, look, I just need time to do this, he really then and wasn't able to deliver on much of the growth. Now, India is growing, but it's not growing faster than it did under Congress, and there are some suggestions that it's actually growing more slowly. I think that's actually probably pretty widely accepted. But still, then he had really doubled down on Hindu nationalism, and since 2019, right? That was when the Citizenship Amendment Act came in and so forth. So he's also combined that with real schemes of let me give something to you. So, there are populist schemes that bring cooking stoves is one that we've mentioned, and there are others which deliver things directly to people. So it's a combination of things. The most consistent vote bank, though, for the BJP is high caste individuals. And one thing that has been true of Indian politics is that it has genuinely democratized in terms of caste, right? 100 years ago, the people in the top positions of power almost everywhere in India, which was, of course, then under colonial rule, were the very top caste, 1-2% of society. That's no longer true. And so that group has, in relative terms, lost out in power. And so there is that group is generally supportive of a kind of celebration of Hindu nationalism, because in the traditional scripts, they sit at the top of a social hierarchy. And so they're reacting to loss. So that's a lot of different things going on. It's not one thing, but it's not infinite things either. There's Hindu nationalism. There's a real focus on economic development. There's a cobbling together of coalitions. And there's some real schemes that deliver things to people who really see that as Modi's looking out for them.
Very interesting. So, Professor Tudor, you mentioned a lot about human nature, that we are wired, that we have the desire to be part of the community. So, when it comes to political science, and especially nationalism, is the problem in the world that we have too much nationalism, or is it that we have too little shared national identity between us?
I would say it's neither of those. It's that we have too little of the right kind of nationalism. In a world where power is distributed to nation states, and whoever defines nationalism has a leg up in the bid for political power, it's defining nationalism in such a way that reflects the nations that we all live in, which are increasingly diverse, in which the historical figures of belonging often celebrated particular groups, one gender, particular religions. And increasingly, there are few societies that are genuinely homogenous along those dimensions. So how do we update, without entirely rejecting historical conceptions of nationalism, how do we update our understandings of belonging? What are the stories that we can tell, the people we can celebrate, the myths, because ultimately they are myths, of belonging that we celebrate? And if we can define the we the people in ways that represent the societies within them, then political entrepreneurs, in my view, and this is the work that I'm currently doing, will be less incentivized to use nationalism in ways that divide us from them, because our common conceptions of who the we is are simply more plural.
Interesting. So, do you have maybe an example of a modern country or historically that used the national identity well to build democracy and to build a well-functioning state? That used nationalism in a good way, like you said?
Yes. So the example I would go to is actually Canada.
Okay.
So Canada has this dual British and French colonial legacy. And when Canada gets founded as a nation, of course, they have groups that are geographically concentrated of people who speak French. And they identify French Canadians as a separate group of people whose identities aren't represented in the broader Canadian fabric, which is predominantly English speaking. And so that became a real problem for the politics of Canada. And in the 1980s, the French Canadians had a referendum on seceding from Canada. And it came very, very close, within less than a percentage point of succeeding. So two different versions of succeeding, right? Succeeding means leaving the country, and then succeeding, successful. And in the moment of that threat, Pierre Trudeau adopted a definition of Canadianness that is with Canada today that celebrates hybridity. And so he said, oh, well, French Canadians have a dual identity, but so too do Native Canadians, and so too do Chinese who have come to Canada. They're Chinese Canadian. And that helps people from different backgrounds who have nested identities, because we all have nested identities. We don't all have, identities are not like hats that we can only wear one at a time. We have lots of hats. And the hat that we are sort of as at the top of our head that's visible at any one moment in time is often situational. So it takes Chinese Canadians and says, your Chinese heritage can be celebrated within the fabric of being Canadian. And so and to this day, Canada has a very high walls around it in terms of immigration. So you need to have the talent or resources to come to Canada as an immigrant. But there is a narrative of belonging that celebrates the very different places that immigrants have come from and allows them to see themselves as belonging fully to the Canadian nation. And many countries around the world have not adopted that kind of hybridity, although we are seeing increasing levels of immigration, even increasing in very homogenous countries like Japan, which of course has a low fertility and rate and is therefore not a replacement. And the question is, how do we deal with this very sharp drop-off in labor? It's often going to be through immigration. So these questions of how do you create societies that are cohesive, in which people who come from outside of the society and who aren't historically from there, how do you provide a pathway for them to see themselves as belonging fully to that nation? And that's what Canada represents.
Interesting.
Do we have a time or should we close it?
Now we have.
We have time? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to take you back to India from this example of Canada, which is that India is unlike Canada. It's just incredibly diverse. There's nothing common between each of us just 100 kilometers away in terms of identity, language, caste, culture. So I understand that in Canada, I guess maybe I'm making a judgment call here that it was easier to do it. But when India was founded in 1947, after independence, and when the constitution was being written, there was certain decisions that the makers of the constitution had to do, which is that either you put it in the constitution, identities, or you make it more cohesive and give everyone equal rights. And at that point of time, the Indian makers decided that the decision would be to put it in the constitution, and after an X number of years, kind of like remove it so that there's more cohesion. What do you think could have been something that they could have done at that point of time to make it like Canada? Because India is, in fact, a deeply unequal country, even now, with all our identities very entrenched with our caste. So what do you think that could have been done at that point of time, or was the decision right?
Well, it's very hard to imagine how the makers of the Indian Constitution could have, especially with a colonial regime that was trying to divide the nationalist movement, made really effectively different decisions. And so it's, they were the Indian nationalists who were setting up the basis of governing an independent India and writing the Constitution, still the world's longest constitution, written over a period of 3 years, borrowed, in fact, from the Irish Constitution.
Yeah.
And that Constitution made concessions to particular groups that were really needed in the context of, again, this colonial regime that was trying to potentially split off different caste groupings from the nationalist movement. So I don't think that much could have been done that was different. I do think that there needs to be a celebration of different heroes that represent different social groupings, and we have a couple of those, Ambedkar. But increasingly with time, the nation is always a project that is growing and changing. It needs to be, because the people are always growing and changing. And the narratives of belonging, when they get too far out of sync with the demographic realities, it spells trouble, because there's an opportunity then for political entrepreneurs to take advantage of the differences between what people are, who they feel they are, and what is represented historically. So I don't think much could have been done. at that time. But today, it's important that the battle about what it means to be Indian doesn't get completely defined by what one political party decides it is. So some of the most effective protest movements have been the ones that have really taken the Indian flag, taken the symbols of the nation, and say, I'm absolutely proud to be Indian. But I just define what that is differently. Let me bring it actually to the UK. So the UK right now is experiencing a controversy over flags. Many of you might have seen flags up on the flagpoles. And this is a really interesting instantiation of this struggle. So the group that is raising this flag is saying, look, I'm proud to be British, or I'm proud to be English. What's wrong with that? Now, of course, there are certain connotations to the groups that are raising this, but they're creating a situation in which many groups around the country are taking down the flags and saying, and that can be interpreted as, I'm not proud to be British or English. And I think a much more effective technique is to pluralize that narrative, to say, well, yes, I'm also proud to be British or English, but what that means is different to me. And there are so many symbols around that one could use. The World Cup is coming up this summer. Look at the British or the English national football team, right? They're incredibly diverse. What about saying, this is my England, right? I'm proud of my England, and this is what my England looks like. So the fight should be about, from all sides, should be about engaging with nationalism rather than leaving nationalism to be defined by any one political group.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. But to close out, I'm going to ask you, because we are a school of public policy, we don't want to leave with a loss of hope and skepticism. And you've told us so many times that we're simply living in that cycle of democracy, which might be less, and then we might come to a time of more democracy and a stronger democracy. So if you could give us one hope for the future, what would that be?
Well, I'm looking at it. All right, I'm looking at people who are looking at the public policy problems in the world and who are engaging with people who disagree with them and trying to find space to innovate and to address the problems of today with energy. And that's what gives me hope for the future. It's why I teach at a school of public policy.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So thank you, Professor Tudor.
Yeah.
This is Oxford Policy Pod. We hope our viewers, of course, our viewers will love it, and we invite everyone to watch all our episodes, and many more are here to come. Thank you.
Thank you.